All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Jason Schlude, who is an archaeologist and professor of classics and history at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Additionally, his research focuses on the Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern worlds, and he's the author of the book Rome, Parthia, and the Politics of Peace, The Origins of War in the Ancient Middle East. And lastly, he's also a former professor of mine. So, Jason, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Ben. It's great to see you.
I'm just curious because I don't think we've ever had this conversation, but when did you first get interested in ancient history?
Boy, that's a good question. I developed a real interest for history in high school, but I don't think it was till I had gotten to college that I discovered ancient history, and ancient history through the field of classics. One of the things that I just loved about it, and I should say I first encountered it through the field of religious studies. So I was taking an intro to Hebrew Bible class, which then unfolded into going on an archaeological dig in Israel. And, that was my introduction really to archaeology and ancient history in a substantial way. And that then led me that next fall to taking, ancient Greek history and Greek and anything ancient that I possibly could. So that's how I got involved with it. And I was just really enamored with it, Ben. It was a field where what was both frustrating was also really exciting. So a field where the evidence was very fragmentary quite frequently, right? You would imagine what the perfect source would be, and it wasn't always there. So you had to be really creative with
Sure.
doing history, working on that particular period. So I love that part. And I also just loved there's a certain amount of mystery with ancient history, right? That sort of I think draws people. But beyond that, I found that really the ancient world, in a number of ways, was certainly different than the modern world, but in other ways, it was strikingly similar. Similar problems were encountered, similar solutions were developed, sometimes constructive, other times not. So that ability to enter into that landscape, which on the one hand felt very foreign, but only for a short while before you saw that the contours of the landscape were actually quite similar to the contours of our landscape today. And at that point, I was hooked, and I have been ever since. And in many ways, certainly in my professional teaching career, I would say that increasingly I found myself getting broader and broader and trying, in every way I can to put the past in conversation with the present. So I love that part of it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. What would you say are some of the major things that have struck you in all your research that kind of connect to the world today from ancient history? Because I think, there is a tendency for a lot of people that are interested in history to kind of focus on the last 200 years and kind of, you know, ignore the ancient world a little bit when these are human societies that were very developed and very intellectual and very similar to us in so many
Mhm.
ways. They just lived in a different time.
Well, I think so. This is, a question that sort of stretches in a wide variety of different directions. One of the things I would say that I've found really intriguing, and students do too, is just as one example, studying the ancient Roman Empire. And when I say empire in this case, I mean there are kind of two different ways to define Roman Empire. There's Roman territorial empire, right, which is, that group of territories largely around the Mediterranean, though increasingly stretching into Europe, that the Romans conquered and made a part of their sphere of influence. That was taking place during the period of what we call the political Roman Republic, right? That period during which Rome, within the state of Rome, sovereignty rested with its people, right? So we can talk more about that. Um, that was a process always already ongoing then, So that's empire, sometimes I describe with a little e. There's also sometimes empire with a big E, which is political empire. And that is when Rome evolved from a republic into a political empire ruled by an emperor, in which patronage and power tended to be concentrated within the hands of a Roman emperor. So, um, in this case, in terms of the Roman territorial empire, when that developed, there was a tremendous amount of cultural diversity within the Roman Empire. If we're looking for substantial bodies of evidence that document what it's like when a variety of different people from different religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, language backgrounds, what happens when those people live next to one another, rub shoulders with one another, have to chart a course and live their lives next to each other. The Roman Empire is one of the best examples I think that we can look at. And you see tensions that are in that society when different groups of people come together. They can produce serious bouts of violence. And at the same time, you can see tremendous moments of creativity where different cultural traditions speak to one another and produce really, really amazing works of literature and thinking that we can benefit from. So that's actually like one thing that I find myself teaching often about with students, and it helps them see their current world in a way that they otherwise maybe didn't. Beyond that, I think you could, I am, I think you can also mention other examples too. I'm very much a political historian, a social historian, a cultural historian. Politically, I find all kinds of connections between past and present, right? That ancient Roman state and modern day, and I find myself increasingly, trying to draw attention to those and write on those, and have an opportunity to talk about them because I think they're super valuable. And again, they help us understand our world in a way that we might not otherwise have. They give us a point of orientation, and sometimes there are even direct links between why our political world and the cultural world that we live in looks the way it does, and it goes back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece too.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating concept because we talk about the United States and like, oh, the world's oldest democracy. Um,
Yeah.
and obviously others have done this before the United States ever existed, or was ever even a thought of existing. And so,
Hmm.
what were the sort of, democracies of ancient Greece and ancient Rome like then?
I love your question. I think it's a really important one. I think there are a couple things that are important that your question um, highlights, right? One is that there are a tremendous number of borrowings that the founders of our country made when they were creating our different political organs and the foundation of our country. So we can talk about those for sure. And then beyond that, I would note that there are other, I don't know, just elements from Roman history that we can potentially learn from. You're focused more on the positive, so I'll draw attention to that first of all. The other thing I would just say as a preliminary to this, one reason why I think it's really important to engage in this conversation is because it helps us see that we aren't the ones who created all of this, right? I think we hear a lot about American exceptionalism, and this is actually, in many ways, this is a bipartisan issue. I feel like there are a few bipartisan issues maybe lately, but you'll hear both Democrats and Republicans talk about the American experiment, talk about how it's exceptional, talk about how it's a model. Um, and it's very true that the documents that our founders created, the Declaration of Independence, this is a remarkable document in the history of human society. Having said that, they didn't create that all on their own, right? So the idea that you would have a society um, in which there would be a certain amount of political equality, right? Which is what, I mean, democracy, it literally means power of the people, right? The idea that you have power distributed within the state beyond just one group or class of people. And just for what it's worth, there's the term democracy, there's also the term republic. These are terms that are used, sometimes confused, sometimes people juxtapose them to one another and will think that a republic is necessarily different than a democracy. There are some differences to them, but there are some fundamental similarities too, which is the idea of having power, political power distributed in a society beyond a small class of people, but more broadly. So certainly within the Greek world, Greeks are often presented as the creators of democracy, and certainly the term itself is Greek. Not all Greeks had democracies, right? They had a variety of different forms of government. They had the most famous democracy would be Athens, for sure. And most of our literary evidence comes from Athens, so it's the democracy that I would say that we understand best. And certainly the democracy that would have been on the mind of the founders of our country most prominently when they were creating the United States of America. There were also, though, oligarchies in Greece, right? When oligarchy means rule of a few. So you might call those aristocracies, would be another term that you could apply to that, where you had, a group of elite families that often had a certain amount of economic power and land ownership who played the most powerful role in setting the political policy of the state and charting its direction. So you had democracies, you had oligarchies, and you also, within the ancient world, you had monarchies, right? Those are the three forms of government that the Greeks themselves identified in different categories. When we think about political science and the creation of that field, right, that started with the Greeks. It started with Thucydides and philosophers and history writers after him who thought a lot about what are different potential political states and what could those look like. You could have kingship, you could have aristocracy, you could have democracy, right? So of those three, democracy started in Greece in that way, and Athens was the most prominent for sure. But the founding fathers, they selected the term republic deliberately, right? As a term that they would throw around for what they were trying to do in the United States of America in this republic. That's a Latin term, right? Coming from res publica, meaning the public thing, right? The shared thing, the common thing, right? This is a government that we share, right? And that goes back to the Roman Republic, right? That period of Rome's history in which, again, sovereignty rested with its people. Rome started as a monarchy, right? No one disputes that. And then it evolved from there after the monarchy was overthrown into a system of government that, if you like, was a blend, you could say, of aristocracy and democracy, where both of those elements were definitely a part of it. And the founding fathers were well aware of that.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and also it's important to highlight just how many connections there are between the founding of the United States and its predecessors and ancient Rome and the Athenians and ancient Greece. You know, today many Americans, and regardless of political affiliation, all feel like democracy in the country or the republic, as others may call it, is kind of struggling right now. So, like,
Mhm.
what are the lessons that people can take from the struggles of democracy in the Greco-Roman world?
I like this question. This is an important one. To answer this question, right? To answer this question, can I talk to you about an author that probably very few people know about,
Go for it.
um, who aren't, classic students or haven't been classics majors or ancient history majors? It's a history writer, a Greek history writer named Polybius. Okay. Many people know about Herodotus, right? A Greek writer who is often called the father of history, right? He's famous for writing about the Greco-Persian Wars, right? Those wars, several of them fought between the Greeks on the one hand and the Persians on the other. After Herodotus, you had Thucydides, right? Who's writing in 5th century BCE. Thucydides is really interested in the Peloponnesian War, and he writes a history of that battle between the Athenians on one side and their allies, and the Spartans on the other and their allies. That historical writing tradition was picked up by another author named Xenophon, which, probably more than a few people have heard of as well. And he kind of carries that line of Greek history into the 4th century BCE. Okay. Polybius is another Greek historian, though, who's writing in the 2nd century BCE. So in a period that we call the Hellenistic period and a little bit later. And Polybius, his family's from Achaia in Greece. And in the mid 2nd century BCE, there was a conflict at one point between the Roman Republic and some Greek states and leagues, which included the Achaean League at one point. And Rome won. Rome often won, if not immediately. They were able to have a lasting power that helped them be successful over time. And one of the things that they insisted were that a number of hostages from the Greek world, from the Achaean League, were to come to Rome and essentially be, you could call it imprisoned, but they didn't have prisons as we normally think of them. Instead, these were individuals who came and actually resided with Roman aristocrats. They were basically aristocrats from Greece coming over and living with Roman aristocrats in Rome. Polybius was one of these individuals, and he spent a large part of his adult life in Rome. Second century was a critical period for the development of the Roman Empire. It was expanding tremendously in its power. It already was fully established in the Western Mediterranean. By the time Polybius came around, they were already in a very prominent position in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. But Polybius saw a lot of this firsthand, how this developed over time. And he was amazed at this. And so he decided to write a history where the focal point of that history was to talk about how Rome, within a 50-year period, effectively established mastery within the Mediterranean, right? And he writes about political events in that history. Most famously, he writes about the war between Rome and Hannibal of Carthage. But at a certain point in his account, he pauses and he says, we need to talk about the Roman Constitution, because this is something that's actually quite important to Rome's success, and people need to understand why this is so. This is a discussion that the founders of our country read, most certainly, and they were inspired by and they kept in mind when they built our government. I talked about the different forms of government earlier in our conversation, right? The idea of kingship, the idea of aristocracy, the idea of democracy, right? Polybius does two things with that. He reviews these concepts. One of the things he says that's important as well is he says that there are positive forms of each of these forms of government and negative forms, right? A monarchy is a form of government in the hands of one person in which the people agree to it, right? It's constitutional in that sense, and it's a positive form. But a monarchy can devolve into a tyranny, right? Where an individual, rules a country in a very authoritarian way, in a way that's not very popular, and in a way that's not just, right? An aristocracy ruled by a few can be an effective form of government, he argues, but it can also turn into an oligarchy ruled by a few in which they're mainly out for their interests and they're ignoring the broader interests of their people, right? And you can have a democracy, which we always think of as a really positive thing, right? But you can also have, and I love this particular Greek term, an ochlocracy. That's the rule of the ochlos, or the mob, in which democracy evolves in a way where democratic institutions are being ignored, and it's ruling in a way that is no longer just, or it's problematic in different ways. So he talks about that. One of the things in this context he says is amazing about Rome is he talks about Rome as having a mixed constitution. It has elements of kingship. It has elements of an aristocracy. It has elements of democracy. And he says that mixed constitution is very, very effective. For example, okay, where do they have kingship, right? They overthrew the king. So how is that a part of it? Well, Rome had an executive branch of government in which they had two consuls elected every year. The closest thing that we would have is a president, right? So executive authority was exercised in two consuls who basically for 1 year had like absolute power. In Latin, it was called imperium within the Roman state. They commanded the army in the field. What they decided went, right? Life or death over soldiers. They had a very powerful role. They had aristocratic elements in their Senate, right? Their senatus, which was a repository basically for and they were aristocrats who had been elected to key positions within the state after, their particular role, or once they reached the threshold office, they entered this advisory body whose recommendations often had the thrust of law. They were largely aristocrats, and within the Roman Republic, that was probably the most powerful political body within the state. And then they also had a democratic element. They had the Roman people who brought themselves together in different assemblies to elect magistrates, to decide whether to approve war or not, to pass legislation. So Romans had all of these elements in the mix, and he said this was incredibly important. It's when they work together, it can be a powerful system. And when they don't, that's sometimes by design because it's a mixed constitution. There's supposed to be checks and balances, he said. And that was one of the powerful things about the Roman Republic. obviously, sirens should be going off in your head when you're thinking about the development of our state and an executive branch of a president and the fact that we have a Senate and the idea that there is a balance of power with checks and balances. That's coming right out of the playbook of Greece and Rome specifically. So that kind of goes back to the idea of what are our borrowings, okay? The other thing that Polybius does that I think is valuable for us is he also talks about how there can frequently be an evolution of government within a state, right? Like we're so good as Americans, I think, and I think it's not just folks in the United States, but folks in other countries too, at focusing in on our own moment and assuming that it can't change and it is the way it is now and forever. We sort of forget that actually we did start as a monarchy when we were ruled by the British Empire,
Right.
that we evolved into something else. Political evolution happens, and Polybius recognized that. He even sort of had a thought experiment and said, if you were to have, a perfect, hypothetical theoretical situation with human beings, the first form of government that they would have, once somebody established power, would be kingship. You'd have a just king, right? And then that king, as generations would go on and power would be passed on, those kings might just assume they have a right to this, and they might forget their people, and forget to rule in their interest. And, some powerful people are going to come together, aristocrats, and say, you're out. And we're going to form a new government. It's going to be an aristocracy. And for a time, those individuals are aware of what's in the interests of the broader population. But, maybe a generation or two, a few generations go on, and they too forget that they don't just have a right to political power and that they shouldn't just be focused in on their own interests, but that there are broader interests too. That's when you're overthrown by the people and you have a democracy. And sometimes folks in a democracy can come to maybe take that for granted as well. And within a democracy, individuals can try to manipulate a democracy, in different ways for their own interests. And it can become dysfunctional, in which you have more a rule by a violent mob. And that's how
Yeah.
you can next form. So there's an evolution there, right? When he thought about Rome, it's actually amazing. He's writing in the second century BCE. So this is in the heart of the Roman Republic before you ever have an empire. And he at that time is thinking of Rome, I think, as a blended aristocracy and democracy. And he predicts, he says, you know what? Rome in time is going to have mob rule. It's going to have an autocracy. And in many ways, what did happen at the end of the Roman Republic, for different reasons that we can talk about, because I think we can learn from those as well, you had a population that became a people that became frustrated. It became a dysfunctional democracy in a way that awaited opportunists who were willing to use their government positions for their own interests. That's where now you can start to talk about, figures, potentially like Pompey and Caesar, and later Mark Antony, and ultimately Octavian, later known as Augustus, who became the first Roman emperor, right? So for us, I think in reading that particular document for us, I think that first of all, it's arresting and it's important to remember that there is an evolution, and political states don't just stay the way they are forever. Changes happen over time. Changes will happen. And so, we have this democracy. What are possibilities for us? Polybius would say you should watch out for an autocracy. You should watch out for a rule of a mob. And the person who's ultimately going to take advantage of that, that's going to be a tyrant who's going to reintroduce the idea of what we would call more autocratic and authoritarian power.
Yeah, I mean that's a super important thing to mention because I think there is this uh especially as more and more generations are kind of born into the United States, where you kind of forget more and more about the complexities of creating this country in the first place and the
Mhm.
vulnerabilities there are just inherently in a democracy, because it's so easy to abuse this system if you set it up that way, where you start putting in people in positions of power that may not care so much about the founding principles. There's no law in the universe that suggests that we have to be a democracy or we're going to stay one. Um, you know,
No. And we can see moments of tension right now, signs that indicate that there are, tensions and problems there that could evolve into something even worse than what it currently is. Right. So you can see that. I mean, I do think that um, one sign when you look at ancient Rome that I think you can think about in our context as well, that did indicate that there was a change afoot is political violence. Political violence is a thing. When people try to enforce their will, not just through legal means, establish legal principles and methods, but through forms of violence. Right. So, I mean, I know it's a controversial topic, but January 6th and what happened on January 6th in the nation's capital, where you had a protest that evolved into a riot and an attack on the Capitol of the United States of America. When you look at that, that is you could look at that as one example of mob rule, right? This was a group of people, largely, that did not accept the results of a legitimate democratic election, an election that uh, had been reviewed in numerous courts. Elements of it had been reviewed by the Department of Justice under Donald Trump, and there was not evidence found for there to be significant um, fraud in any way, shape, or form. But these were individuals that, as we largely understand it, believed that there was, and they were motivated by it to reject that valid election, right? That is concerning that you would reach a moment like that. Why does that have to be just a one-off moment? I think sometimes we can make the mistake too of imagining that a democracy can fall immediately, right? And I do think things can happen fast, but I think if we learn something from ancient Rome as well, it's that these things don't always develop in a day, right? These are things that can develop over a decade and over a century, and more, that ultimately can lead to the creation of more of an authoritarian government.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because I think you know, you can see countries kind of, especially countries that maybe have a very young democracy, you can kind of see that fall apart pretty fast
Mhm.
over a few decades. If you've had one that's established for, over 100 years, usually there's enough institutions in place where you can't really knock them all down at once.
Mhm.
It's more of a game of slowly wrestling power away from them, which is a little bit more complicated. Um, it's interesting, were there any contested elections or anything in ancient Rome or in Athens or
Well, there was certainly, could be, especially in the late Republic, violence around different elections.
okay.
And yes, there were controversies around people running multiple times for office at different
Okay.
points in time for different roles within the state. And sometimes those led to basically forms of certainly political violence and then assassinations that did happen at times. Um, Yeah, it was there in Rome. There was there Rome had a long history, right? And it didn't just write its constitution in one moment. It's something that was developed organically over time, right? One thing that's clear from early on within the Roman state, when it came to the election of consuls, uh, there were repeat consuls that you had. Sometimes, in a few instances, consuls who would be reelected year to year. But as a rule, there was often at least 1 year between times that you would hold that particular office when you look at the history of the Roman Republic. And even at times in the Roman Republic, they attempted to pass laws that said you could not be consul um, twice within a 10-year period. You need to let a 10-year window elapse. So they did have this idea of trying to limit people's terms in different ways that would prevent somebody from accumulating too much power in their hands because they didn't want to go back to a monarchy, right? But this was a convention that was violated at multiple points, right? And so something that did happen as you move into the late Republic, you have several examples of people who held that consulship in an unprecedented way for periods of time. Marius was one of the earliest who was quite important. Julius Caesar would be an example of another individual along those lines. So for me, and there was frustration that would be expressed by the people at points in time because somebody held the consulship for too long. And then an adjustment needed to be made because it looked too much like you were moving into a particular monarchy. So for me, when I think about us again in terms of signs that would give me concern, how are elections handled? Are they free? Are they fair? Are they disputed? Is there violence at their rejection rather than the acceptance of a democratic process? Are there, interests in changing in some way term limits? That would immediately, should send off sirens of concern for people if there were talk along those lines. And sometimes I think things happen in unintended ways that become significant later. So the recent Supreme Court decision that basically grants a president immunity for all official acts, even after they've held office. Not even the Romans had that then. Julius Caesar is an example of somebody who, after he was consul, he was liable for prosecution after his term of office as consul. And then he held another term of office as what you'd call a proconsul, which had similar powers associated with being consul that made him immune from prosecution. But there was the very real prospect that he was going to be prosecuted when when his term as proconsul had ended in Gaul and he would go back to Rome. So he wanted to run for consulship again, among other things that had the benefit of prolonging his immunity. There were a lot of enemies of his in the Roman Senate that weren't interested in that. So they formally recalled him from office. And that was the moment when he decided, well, I'm going to march on the state of Rome. So anyway, to go back to the US, we're making decisions here to grant really sweeping, what appears to be sweeping immunity to a president that could have consequences in time. It's
Yeah.
disturbing.
Yeah, I mean that was a pretty crazy decision, and I think that there is some odd takes on it where some people would defend it like, oh well, if you're gonna prosecute one person, you have to prosecute all the presidents as if they've equally done things worth prosecuting them for, or that they've all committed crimes, which
Mhm.
um, find kind of odd, an odd way of thinking about it. As also just in general, like if we were such a corrupt democratic system that we had a long list, a laundry list of presidents who've committed crimes worth being
Mhm.
put in prison for or something, then I think that we have, we should be doing even more than to try to fix this issue beyond, preventing them from being immune from prosecution later on after office, because that would suggest an even bigger problem to me, even more reason to crack down on the system and what some may consider like this perpetual uh, kind of theme of presidents abusing their power. So it doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to me that they would be think that this would be a good idea to have immunity from prosecution, especially as someone, as people, as citizens, we are very far removed from the source of power in the country. So
I do. I mean, I think I have not read the extent of all of the Supreme Court publications on that in terms of the successful opinion and the dissenting opinion. But I suspect that part of it, they're hoping that this will actually stem dysfunction, right? So the idea that if someone is afraid that they're going to be prosecuted for, a president is afraid that he or she will be prosecuted for using their constitutional powers, that will in some ways create a limitation that might make them less effective in the office.
yes, that's
Um,
exactly it. Yeah.
I do understand the idea as well that there's the danger that every time someone finishes office, there's going to be,
Yep.
significant litigation afterwards. And
Sure.
so I think they're trying to stem that as well. So in that regard, it's a gamble, I think, that they're taking. And I hope that their gamble is right. But
Yeah.
but I get nervous anytime you take these precious institutions, democratic institutions that we have, and and mess with them in significant ways that that doesn't seem to make a more robust democracy, but endangers it rather than that.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
No, I'll go back to this. But another thing, you were asking about elections, controversial elections in antiquity. There is one I can think of now, but you were going to say something. Maybe we can go back to it.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I guess the one thing I think there is a little of irony, when a Supreme Court, in charge of, justice for the entire country makes a
Mm,
decision like this, because in some ways it suggests that they don't really have faith in their own justice system. Because if
yeah.
someone's going to, bring charges against a former president, then the justice system should be able to sort that out. And if the
Hmm.
charges are, false allegations, then it should be easily, thrown out of court, which
Dismissed.
just like the election, challenges that we had in 2020. So it almost suggests to me
Agreed.
that they
Yeah.
don't have much faith in their own justice system, because I wouldn't worry about it if I really believe that the courts are going to make the right decisions and push back against wrongly charged presidents. So
Hmm. Agreed. Like for me, I think that it's not a gamble that I would have taken.
yeah, well, yeah, it'll
Uh,
be certainly interesting. I mean, I know that if I were to imagine some of the authoritarian leaders in different countries around the world being in this position, I'd immediately imagine them taking advantage of this right away, saying every single thing I do is an official act and there's nothing you can do about it. So, in fact, if I want to, dissolve Congress, that's an official act. I don't care if it's against the Constitution because, I'm the president. So,
I can do that. One election that stands out to me that ends up being one that's quite consequential in different ways is the election for the consulship in 64 BCE. Um, the two people that loom largest in that particular election are the famous Marcus Tullius Cicero, Roman statesman, Roman philosopher, Roman man of letters, incredibly well-educated individual who spent a lifetime in Roman politics. He was the first in his family to achieve the consulship. In Latin, they called a person like that a novus homo, a new man, right? Because it was so rare that somebody could come from a family that was not already ennobled with a consulship and run and be successful. Okay. So he ran in 64. And one of the people that he ran against in 64 was a gentleman named Catiline. And often when people hear Catiline, folks who have had some ancient history classes, Roman history classes, they will immediately think of the Catilinarian conspiracy, right? The what ended up happening is that Catiline lost that election. Catiline came from a landed political family, and Catiline lost, and that wasn't just his first loss, and he was incredibly frustrated by it. Now, the rest of the storyline, one of the things you have to bear in mind is that one of our most important sources for knowing about all of this is Cicero himself, right? So you have to bear that in mind. Um, what we learn, certainly from Cicero, as Cicero tells this particular story, is after Catiline lost that election. So we don't get what Catiline was saying.
okay.
The idea is that Catiline was tired that, if you like, of the fraud that was the Roman electoral system. He should have been elected. He wasn't. And what he decided to do instead was take advantage of a group of people within the Roman state who felt like they had been left behind, who economically were not in the best position. They wanted more, right? And these, disaffected individuals, he tried to gather a mob out of that to carry out a coup that would presumably overthrow Cicero and his fellow consul and put a person like Catiline in power. Well, Cicero found out about it, and Cicero, with the Roman Senate, pursued it. They got Catiline to flee Rome. They ultimately met Catiline's forces in the battlefield. Catiline went there as well. Catiline was in command of his troops, which you might say clearly that shows that Catiline was culpable here. But also, after Cicero made everyone believe that he was definitely involved in this, where else did Catiline have to go? Right? He seemed to only have one option. So I'm not sure. But ultimately, Cicero and the Roman forces, they were successful over Catiline and this small army that he was amassing, and others that seemed to be implicated in this conspiracy as well, they ended up executing without trial in the city of Rome. So you do have moments like this. And it actually is something that came back to haunt Cicero, because later on, when he was no longer consul, a political enemy of his was able to have Cicero for a period of time exiled from Rome because he had executed Roman citizens without a trial.
Wow.
Now, he was recalled later on, but there's another example of somebody who, in essence, someone who had been consul, who was considered responsible for his decisions even after the fact. And if it was determined illegal, well, there was a consequence for it in which he was banished from Rome.
Jeez.
So you have, I mean, it's interesting. These kinds of examples stretch in a variety of different directions when you think of a modern landscape and how you can potentially apply them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that you're in a kind of interesting position right now in the world because you are someone who has studied extensively, ancient democracies, democracies that kind of gave life to all these other democracies that have, sprouted around the world today. Um, but at the same time, you're living in a democracy that is in one of its biggest crises, in its history in terms of the societal divisions kind of pulling it apart to a certain extent. And everyone kind of, it's a bipartisan issue where people are wondering, what's the future of this country going to be? Can our democratic system last? So what advice then would you give to people that are, you know, having these questions in their head, who are living in this moment historically that will be written about in the future? What should they kind of take away from the past, and maybe how
Mhm.
should they think about their present issues?
I think when it comes to the United States in particular, I'll maybe draw attention to one other thing from ancient Rome, one other feature of the Roman Republic that is important that I think transfers to today as well. When the fall of the Roman Republic was caused by a variety of factors, but two important elements in that fall involved the people of Rome and involved key opportunistic leaders in Rome. Okay. So in the late Republic, there was the sense, due to economic causes, that a number of citizens had been left behind. They found themselves in economic difficulties. And they were pretty angry and trying to figure out what's next. How are you going to support your family? What are you going to do? In ancient Rome, this is actually a direct consequence of the development of a Roman territorial empire. I mean, one of the things that was happening as Rome grew as a state across an empire, you had Roman aristocrats taking Roman armies into the field, to locations that were further and further away from the city of Rome itself. So it wasn't just one short campaign season, you could be gone for years. And when you did that, these were farmers, a number of them with families. Farms are hard to run when you have a whole family working the farm. But you take away an important critical member of the family, and a number of these farms looked like they couldn't be kept up in the same way, and a number of these farmers went bankrupt, right? At the same time, you have these aristocrats, Roman generals, and different officers coming back to Rome, having lined their pockets from conquest with money to burn. And they bought these properties. And not only did they buy available properties, they also brought back slaves from conquest that they could then use to work their different farms. Now, this is a something that some, historians maybe have blown out of proportion, but it was a thing in the ancient Roman state. And there was a group of people who no longer had land and they were trying to figure out what's next, right? So you had a moment where you had a people in need. Okay. If you combine that with um, magistrates who have a healthy self-interest and they are interested in, speaking to their people in need, right? That's not a bad thing, right? What people of state, what statesmen and stateswomen are supposed to do are see where there is suffering and need and address it and try to create a more prosperous, just, and ethical state that's moving in the right direction, right? So you should speak to those particular interests. But in, the late Roman Republic, it seems like you had a series of statesmen who were willing to use those groups of people to their own advantage, right? They basically were populist leaders who cultivated the loyalty of this group, so much so that these groups would follow their leader, even to march on Rome. Happened with Julius Caesar, you know. Now, one of two things, this could be a result of one of two things. Either, on the one hand, these leaders could completely distinguish between their self-interest and the interests of the broader state. And instead, they chose self-interest and were mainly pretending, right? Or in certain cases, there are certain leaders who I think can come around and they don't actually see much of a difference between their needs and the needs of the state. Whatever they need, whatever's best for them is also best for the state. So in that sense, maybe there's some kind of I don't know, and at least an inability to distinguish between one's personal interests and the state that one is leading. Okay. So that combination, I think, of a certain amount of desperation or suffering desperation within a population, if you marry that with an opportunistic leader who is primarily out for his own interests or her interests, that's a concern. So I think you saw that in Rome, and Julius Caesar capitalized on it in different ways. And I mean, he presented himself as the people's champion, right? When I mentioned earlier how people were recalling Caesar from office, and we're going to bring him up on trial. There was another political position within the Roman state called the Tribune of the People. They were especially the champions of the Roman people, and they had a number of very important powers, one of which was the power of veto. They could veto anything within the Roman state and put an end to it. So if someone's trying to pass a law, if they vetoed it, it was going to be it, right? Those tribunes tried to veto some of that legislation, some of those decisions, I should say, that the Senate, the recommendations that the Senate were making, but they were run out of town. So what Caesar had said, he said, tribunes of the people cannot even carry out their functions anymore in the city of Rome. I'm going to march on Rome in the people's interest. Of course, it was also in his own interest too that he was doing what he did. So to bring this back to a modern context, for me, I think it's um, important to pay attention. Like I think we are at a moment in our state, and this is, I suppose, a perpetual issue within the United States of America. There are a number of groups that are in real pain. They have need, right? How are politicians speaking to them? I think we want to pay attention to that. What statesmen are in front of us who seem to be speaking genuinely to the interests of their people. Of course, there's a certain amount of self-interest in terms of a politician. Of course, they want to be successful in terms of their career. They want to affect change. They're human beings who want to be successful in their lives and in their career. They want to be respected for that. They want to have a level of prestige for that. I think that that's natural, right? But I think we want to be cautious when maybe we see signs that there are people in office or people seeking office who maybe have more of their own interests at heart than the interests of the people that they're looking to govern. And I think that's up to each citizen to look at that very seriously and think about that. How are each of these officials, if you like, we're in a presidential year, how are each of these presidential and vice presidential candidates, how are they going to make democracy better? If you believe in democracy, right? If this is something that you value, where power resides in the hands of the people, if you value a republic, okay, which also, it's not different from a democracy. It also celebrates democratic principles. Who are going to be the people who are going to make that the strongest possible? And who are going to be the people who may well undermine that in some ways or lose sight of where the interests of the state and its people potentially diverge from their own personal interests? I think we need to watch out for that. I think it's serious.
Yeah, definitely so. Very powerful historical example you gave there, and yeah, super relevant today, obviously. So just shifting gears a little bit,
Yeah.
what are you currently working on?
Ooh. I'm always working on a few different things.
Yeah,
Okay. I'll just speak to kind of new projects that I'm finding myself engage in. I have a couple different tracks to the research and writing that I like to do. The conversation that I'm having with you, I love these kinds of conversations. It's one of the reasons why I love teaching. And one of the forms of writing that I love to do most is writing for a more popular audience, trying to connect what we do in the past, which can sometimes seem arcane or seem potentially less important to modern day events. So those are things that I don't always know what exactly that article is going to be. I'm sort of watching the development of our political scene and cultural scene like anyone else. And when something catches my eye, then I seek to write on that. Um, I'm somebody who cares about language. I care about the study of ancient Greek and I care about the study of Latin because I also think it's important to read people in their own words when you can. You can't learn every language out there, right? Life's too short. But I think it is important to spend some time learning at least some other language, if only as an act of cultural humility. I think it's important to take the time to try to understand somebody else in their own terms.
yeah,
So and I think that's relevant for modern populations, absolutely. And I think it's relevant for past populations. I think studying Latin and Greek can still help you develop that sensitivity to the views of other people and valuing them, hearing them in their own words. So I'm working on a commentary on a series of New Testament passages to help students learn Greek by actually reading the New Testament and selecting passages that are important ones that, once again, raise questions that are relevant for living in a modern world. So I'm working on that.
that's cool.
And I have another project that I'm very interested in, a broader intellectual history project that um, seeks to map out, some of the bigger challenges and questions that human beings have faced and how they have answered those questions and how they're very much have been in conversation with one another across thousands of years. Once again, it's not as though some of these issues that we face today, they are entirely new issues. These are issues that have been faced before, and there's been a long conversation about them, and it's valuable to study that. So I call that my How to Be Human project. So I'm interested in working on that one as well.
That's awesome. And what would be the best way then for people to kind of keep track of your work and any articles or future books or something that may come out?
Sure. I have a LinkedIn account that I'm pretty active on. I let people know when I publish new things there. So you can find Jason Schlude on LinkedIn and check out what I've posted in the recent past, and I'll put new posts on there. Folks can also, of course, feel free to reach out to me directly via email at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, where, as you said before, I'm a professor of classics and history, and I love it here. And I love the opportunities that it gives me to engage students, including students like you, Ben Baumann.
That's
Uh,
right. That's right. Once upon a time, that's right. Yeah, not too long ago. It's pretty crazy. So good to connect again.
well, I have to, Ben, before we kind of close here, I'm curious, I want to pick your brain too. Like,
Sure, go for it.
this is
Yeah,
a project, I mean, the Roots of Reality, you've been engaged in this for a while, right? And put a lot of work into this, right?
sure.
Talking to a range of people about how to connect the way distant past. We could talk in geologic terms, right? To the present moment. Then what's motivating you right now to do what you do? Where do you see concerns your own self right now? And I'd ask you, like, where do you see opportunities? Like, what gives you hope right now? Why do you
Yeah,
keep doing this?
that's a pretty big question. Well, I mean, I think there's a few different aspects to look at this from. I mean, I think the a combination of my experiences, being a student of yours, for example, um, I think going to the University of Amsterdam and studying big history, looking at things in a big picture scope from the formation of the universe to the present, how things connect, and kind of fusing the traditional history landscape with this big history narrative landscape. I
Hmm.
think just was something I've always been interested in. I growing up, I was always fascinated by science and history. My dad's a historian as well, so it's kind of been something that's always kind of lived in my blood a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there's two ways looking at this. One, we always have these problems to figure out, and I think history is incredibly connected to solving all of them because we know that people before us have overcome lots and lots of things. And I think it's inspiring and also can provide hope by knowing that history because it's like, okay, well, no matter what challenges we're facing today as a society, we can overcome them because others have overcome them in the past. I mean, the fact that we're here today is because past societies and our ancestors living in them overcame those challenges to survive for us to be here having this conversation. Um, and I think that, so when we're thinking about whether it's governmental problems or scientific problems, there are challenges that are always going to be happening. And I feel like life in general is something you can learn a lot from just by studying history because it is a game of just like overcoming one problem after another while simultaneously trying to maintain your own sanity about it. And I think that you get a good perspective when you think about it, things historically, and it allows you to kind of uh, see through the smoke and mirrors of life and navigate it in a way where you can be optimistic and also kind of deal with challenges ahead. So I think it's an invaluable tool and something that I've always tried to promote to people, regardless of their background or where they're coming from, because it is something where we're in this moment of time, we share the planet with the people who are alive today. And so we're
Hmm.
all kind of connected to this, and different generations are going to be sharing it with different people. And so I
Hmm.
feel like we kind of are all in this together and kind of represent this era of time. And so it'd be good to try to help each other out and try to get through it together somehow. So,
I love when I hear you say that, I find myself thinking about history as an opportunity. It's really an opportunity for us to capitalize on a wealth of human experience to help chart our own course for where we want to
yeah.
go, what we want to do. And some of the greatest intellectuals and works, most powerful works of all time are based on that premise that the past is an opportunity for understanding the present. Of one work of literature, this is a whole nother conversation, but Machiavelli's The Prince. One of that is an incredible document about, what can motivate people in terms of political power and how to achieve it and maintain it, right? And he creates that little book, right? Based on a lot of his own personal experience, but the rest of it is drawing on Greece and Rome. And you can see that like turn practically every page and you're going to see a reference to Greece and Rome where he's creating that document, right? Based on having read the past. And we still look at that as a document that is one of the most important political works of all time and still can teach us a lot about human behavior in different ways. History for him was an opportunity to figure out how politics worked in his present moment. Well, we still have all of those Greeks and Romans and other voices in the ancient Mediterranean, and we've got all of those folks who have been in conversation with them for millennia, right? All of that's at our fingertips. I do see it as an opportunity.
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
exciting.
I think that's yeah, that's the a big core of it because when you kind of ignore history or maybe you just kind of pay a little bit of attention to it, but you don't really know much about it, and so you kind of just absorb some parts of history. It's very easy to kind of take away the wrong things from it because you're not really engaging with history much, but you just kind of hear
Mm-hmm.
things and you kind of have this little warped version of what historical events kind of played out, which could be problematic. Or you just ignore it in general and you just kind of naturally fall into this situation where as a society we can kind of repeat mistakes of previous societies. They're not exactly the same, but they're the same in terms of the general picture of what a society is going through. And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, it is something that I think is really important for the continued kind of progression of a society in a positive way.
I think that the work that you do too, I mean, you talk about how there are different forms of history out there. Um, some of them more informed than others.
Sure.
I think the work that you have pursued your own self, right, and going to a graduate program, to broaden your training, deepen your training, and the work that you do with the roots of reality. It's pretty amazing the kinds of conversations you've been having and how you are making those available to the broader public to engage in themselves. What do they think about this? Do they
Yeah.
agree? Do they disagree? How
Well,
do they
and
approach?
that's the fun part about it because yeah, I mean, you're gonna have. I've tried to expand it to as many different people as possible, and I purposely seek out to try to get it in front of a wide variety of people, and it's been really interesting to get feedback from people around the world or from various political persuasions or religious persuasions or different ethnic groups around the world. Um, and I think the main idea about this is that regardless of whether people agree or not agree on certain things, we will all agree on other things, and
Mhm.
we're all in this together. I mean, this is a planet that we share, um, so kind of just putting that at the forefront, and just trying to figure out the rest. I think that's pretty much all we can do as a society, in this time we have. So
And I think we have to lean into the tough questions,
yeah,
right? Like you could avoid tough questions and try to talk
yeah,
about things that are somehow easier
sure,
or less important, cause less controversy, cause less disagreement. Um, when one teaches, right? There maybe you could teach in a way that deliberately tries to keep the past separate from the present, right? Because sometimes people will say, well, you got to keep politics out of the classroom,
yeah,
right? Well, if we're doing that, though, what's the product that we're giving students?
sure,
We're not helping them make the connections between the past and the present. So my take over time, I think we have to be careful with how we bring politics and modern concerns into the classroom, but I think that's our job
yeah,
is how do we lean into those questions that are so critical today and see how the past can speak to them, and give students, give people in the community an opportunity to grapple with the evidence, think about it for themselves, come to their own conclusions, talk with one another about them, see if they modify their thinking, and ultimately come away from that conversation with a greater sense of orientation in the world that they live in and having thought about something more deeply than they had before. It's not
yeah,
about all agreeing all the time, but
yeah.
just the common effort of saying, this is valuable, and let's see if we can do this together wherever we end up on the final question. I think that in itself is a really important constructive activity in our world. So for me, the willingness of, people like you to create series like this. Anybody who watches it, views it, listens to it, treats the ideas seriously, we are all in conversation with one another. And that is a constructive act that brings me great hope.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of my favorite things about like when if someone whether someone's teaching in a classroom and there's disagreement, or if someone's making a comment on social media or something, the fact that the one thing that also I think we can take some positive aspect of even when we disagree is that people care, like they care
Yeah.
enough to say they
Yeah.
disagree, and we all care. That's the good thing about this. I would think if someone were to just basically try to act like they are, you know, uh, politically disengaged completely and have no no thoughts of their own at all, it would be that would be just artificial and almost suggest a different type of political standpoint,
Mhm.
because it would be it's hard to live in a world where you don't care about
Yeah.
something, and as a result, because of that, you're going to disagree with people about something. But again, the fact that we all can agree or disagree on things, we all care, and if we can meet people understanding that, then I think we can make progress, and together we can kind of figure out, okay, well, how do we go forward together despite our disagreements? And this is something that has always been the true lifeblood of a democracy, is that, hey,
Mhm.
okay, we can come together. We don't see eye to eye exactly on this. Um, but we know that we're going to live in the society no matter what together. So we got to solve it and figure out some type of compromise to move forward. Um, Otherwise, divide we fall. So
Ben, thank you.
yeah, no, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge once again with me. And yeah, I think a lot of people will be happy to to keep in touch and see what else is going on with you. So,
But teachers, I think a number of teachers say, good teachers, that they learn, as much from their students as their students learn from them, and they probably learn more. I'll just say you're one of those students, Ben, who's taught me a great deal, and I'm very grateful. So thank you for the work you do.
well, likewise, obviously, you've been a huge mentor in my life and continue to be one. So, thanks again.